Good morning, everybody. My name is Carl Horton, and I am delighted to welcome you all to this BCIS webinar. Are you using the right index and how to manage inflationary risk on construction projects? I am pleased to say that we've had a great response with a lot of people registering for this webinar, and it's nice that so many of you can join this session today. The contents of today's webinar are as follows. So I'm going to start proceedings with a brief introduction. And then we'll do a bit of context setting around inflation. So what is it? Why allow for inflation on construction projects and how to allow for inflation on construction projects. Then we'll do a little bit about indexation. So actually, what is an index? What do you want to measure? And how specific do you want to get? And our final sort of segment in there is how do we implement indices into construction contracts? And within that, we've got one sort of case study example. And then we'll do a bit of a summary, a wrap up, and then we'll do some Q&A right at the end. As I said at the start of the webinar, my name is Carl Horton, and I'm the Chief Data Officer at the BCIS. A quick bit of background on me. I'm a quantity surveyor and have worked within the construction industry for over 20 years. During that time, I've worked in multiple sectors across the built environment and delivered a host of project solutions on data management, benchmarking, and of course, inflation. I'm delighted to say joining me today are three colleagues. Firstly, Joe Martin, who is lead consultant and is part of the fabric of the BCIS, having been here since the very beginning. Joe's experience in the field of construction inflation is second to none, and I'm delighted to have him join us on this webinar today. I'm also joined by David Crossway. David wears two hats at the BCIS. He is our chief economist as well as our head of consultancy. He is an industrial economist specialising in the construction industry and possesses more than 2 decades of experience in construction, academic research and consultancy. His career has combined construction experience with economics expertise. Finally, also on the team is Ian Pegg. Ian is a solutions architect at the BCIS and has a wealth of experience in the field of statistics and inflation calculations and oversees the compilation of our flagship index, the BCIS All-in Tender Price Index. I'll just conclude the introduction segment with a few minor bits of housekeeping. Firstly, today's webinar is being recorded and it will be made available on our website, and we will notify you when the recording is available. It's usually around a week later. Finally, there will be Q&A at the end of the webinar, and for any questions that aren't answered, we will also add those answers to our website. Right, you've probably had enough from me, so I'll now hand you over to David, who will take you through the first section designed to provide some context setting on inflation.
Thanks, Carl. We're going to start by setting a bit of context. So we're going to look at the what, why and how. So first we're going to touch on what is construction inflation, what it's currently running at, why allow for inflation on construction projects, and then how to allow for inflation on construction projects before we move on to some more practical ways for you to mitigate inflation risk on projects. So firstly, what is inflation? Essentially, it's a known unknown. We know that prices tend to change over time, more often than not increasing, but we don't know by how much. So that becomes an uncertainty and therefore a risk to a potential project. Inflation really does impact the construction industry. Particularly the cost estimation process due to its effect on materials prices, labour costs and plant and equipment rates. And the current high level of inflation that we've been experiencing has really increased the difficulty in estimating future costs. If we take a look at construction specific inflation, specifically cost and price inflation measured by BCIS General Building Cost Index and the All-in TPI Tender Price Index, we can see that the cost index is almost at a generational high, recently of 15% year-on-year change. Some stability is returning, but inflation is still a major issue. The tender price index is slightly more volatile, a bit more erratic, and much more dependent on market conditions. If we now look at the main cost drivers, the input costs to the data we saw on the previous slide, specifically materials costs and labour costs, we can see where the bulk of the inflationary impact has been. Most of it in material costs. Again, a generational high. I think we have to go back to the 1970s to see a spike in materials costs quite as high as this. So those price increases have been dramatic. They are starting to slow, but we're predicting that labour cost will probably overtake, will replace materials cost increases as the main cost driver going forward, given that we've got ingrained labour shortages, and we're expecting those to push up wage inflation over the next year or so. So we've seen what construction inflation is currently running at and what our predictions for the future are. So why allow for inflation? Well, clearly we're in a period of high or uncertain inflation levels at the moment, not only in the wider economy but specifically in the construction economy. On big complex projects that are delivered over a significant period of time, the impact of inflation can be significant in monetary terms. It can actually be one of the single largest cost accounts on a long, complex project. So as we've seen, there are currently significant inflationary pressures in construction, and it seems unreasonable to ask a contractor to commit to a fixed price arrangement in the current climate. Contractor insolvency partway through a project will almost inevitably mean that the client owner will pay more than budgeted for the project, and that's assuming that they can actually secure a replacement contractor to take the work on. So to ensure the best price on a contract, clients' owners should consider sharing the inflation risk contractually. While we cannot directly control the inflation impact, as it's clearly out of our control, there are some approaches which help mitigate the effects of inflation, and we'll be looking at those in the next slide. So, how do we allow for inflation on construction projects? As we've seen, we consider inflation to be a known unknown, a risk that we know exists but can't accurately quantify the potential impact of. So we need to take steps to try and mitigate the inflation risk. We outline three approaches here: the use of provisional sums, cost-plus contracts, and fluctuation provisions, which should help address some of the adverse effects of inflation. Provisional sums can be included in contracts to cover items that may be subject to potential price increases. Cost-plus contracts are a form of procurement where the contractor is reimbursed for the actual costs incurred for the work done. Although it should be noted with this approach that the risk of inflation is then wholly with the client. Contracts can also include fluctuation clauses to allow the contract price to be adjusted to reflect inflation throughout the contract period. Usually the clause will be aligned to a specific index to measure any price changes. The use of fluctuation provisions for labour and materials had fallen over recent decades, given that inflation had been relatively stable. However, soaring costs over the last 3 years are making more parties consider using inflation clauses. Index-linked inflation adjustment clauses provide a simple and transparent method of calculating and reimbursing fluctuations in the underlying costs on a project. They allow contractors to price and manage a contract knowing that they do not need to price in the risk of inflation. The most common method of allowing for inflation is through the use of indices. In the UK, the most frequently used indices are the Price Adjustment Formula Indices, or PAFI, which are prepared by BCIS. In the next section, we'll look at all you need to know about indexation.
Thanks, David, and hello, everyone. Indices are deceptively simple. They're pure numbers, and we instinctively think we know about them. But in reality, it's quite a complex and sometimes controversial area of statistics. We have the Encyclopedia Britannica definition of a sign or number that shows how something is changing or performing, or a number that indicates changes in the level of something. The indices that BCIS produce are all numbers that indicate how prices or costs are moving, and all our indices have a base of 100. Calculating an index is not a trivial exercise, even when the data has been collected. The formula used can be controversial, as you may have heard with the debate over phasing out the RPI. There's not time in this seminar to even start that topic, but calculating a percentage change between 2 points using the relevant index numbers is pretty trivial. In the context of construction, there are three main groups of indices: tender, output, and cost. Tender price indices being a measure of the agreed price for the works at commit to construct and are ideal for updating cost analyses or cost plans. Output price indices measure the price of work being carried out and are typically a fusion of tender and cost indices, but have relatively few day-to-day applications. While cost indices measure the cost of resources purchased by constructors at one point or another in the supply chain. You can see from the chart that they can move rather differently. Another way of slicing the range of indices available is to look at how general or specific they are. All indices are averages of some basket of items, but some are very broad averages, while others can be quite specific. The BCIS General Building Cost Index measures costs for a basket of labour, materials and plant based on an average composition of buildings from examples that were submitted to BCIS. There are subdivisions of that, so you could look at the index based on steel-framed buildings only. It still includes concrete, brick, glass, etc., etc., but the proportions will be different. Going down a level, the price adjustment formula indices are designed to track the price of individual work categories, while resource cost indices measure individual materials or labour. There are other characteristics that you need to look out for. Most BCIS indices attempt to track prices given constant quantity and quality. So, for example, if the specification of a sheet of insulation changes, an adjustment should be made to the price used in the index calculation to compensate. Changes in building regulation are a case in point. Most BCIS indices do not reflect any change in the cost of construction required by a change in specification. So if more insulation is needed, that will not be reflected in the index. The House Rebuilding Cost Index is an exception to that, as changes in building regulations will affect the cost of rebuilding a house. So you do need to look carefully at the composition of the index to make sure it matches your requirements. If the price you're adjusting includes consultants' fees or land, then you may need to factor those in. Labour is another challenging area. We know that operatives may be employed under national or local wage agreements, or could be agency workers or labour-only subcontractors. But if based on a wage award, might there be bonuses paid? And should they be accounted for? There are also taxes, levies and allowances that could be factored in. The price adjustment formula indices are generally based on nationally agreed wage awards, as those awards are a relatively stable base, and you could argue that other sources are part of the supply chain. But there are a range of labour indices available. The BCIS Labour Cost Index reflects nationally agreed wage awards as it relies on PAFI. The Hayes BCIS Site Wage Cost Index measures the cost of agency labour, while average weekly earnings figures from ONS do exactly what it says on the tin, but beware, because they're not adjusted for hours worked. For materials, there are different considerations but similar choices as to where in the supply chain to make the measurement and what to include. As we saw last year with red diesel, taxation can be important, but may not affect every agent equally. PAFI targets factory gate prices of materials, as once again other sources might be considered part of the supply chain. So, despite being pure numbers, there's a lot of murky detail to explore with indices. And now, Joe is going to look at some of the practical implications.
Thank you, Ewan. I'm just going to run through a few things that you should consider when you're drafting an inflation index clause in a contract. You need to think about what works you're going to be covered by the index. So is it going to be the whole building, in which case you need to define the works that are included in the building. The indices that you choose must clearly match those works. You need to define the index clearly in the contract. We constantly come across cases where people have just said we're going to use the BCIS index, which isn't helpful if none of the people who said what that was are there anymore. So make sure you clearly define both the name of the index and where it can be found. You need to check the frequency of the index. So if you want to update monthly, it needs to be an index that's issued monthly. You need to define the base date of the index. So you need to say clearly from what point are you going to apply the inflation. It will very often be the base date of the contract itself. You need to define the frequency of the updating. So you need to say that you're going to update it quarterly or monthly or whatever it is you intend to do. You need to state the date in which it's going to be applied. So it would normally be the date of the valuation, but you need to make that clear in the clause. You need to say what you're going to do about provisional and firm indices. You can apply provisional indices and then adjust them when they become firm. And you need to say what you would do if there are any revisions to the index that is going to be applied. You need to define the calculation of the update. So it would normally be the percentage update from the base date to the date of the calculation applied as a percentage to the works that are covered by that index. And you need to define the precision that you're going to apply to the index, i.e. the number of decimal places that you're going to apply in the calculation. The practice of updating for inflation using indices was introduced in the 1970s. It was designed by an organisation called the National Economic Development Organisation, which is why the indices are sometimes referred to as the Netto indices. But they're actually always been called the price adjustment formula indices. They were designed to be used with the standard contracts of today, the JCT and the GC Works 1 for government contracts. Before that time, there was a very laborious process of actually going through timesheets and invoices each month to see what was being paid for work and labour. It was very time consuming. As a very young surveyor, I used to do it, and I was very glad when the index linking came in. Subsequent contracts, the NEC particularly, have been designed so they would work with the PAFI indices and inflation adjustment clauses. There are currently separate PAFI for building, civil engineering, highways maintenance, and specialist engineering. So why were they introduced? We think these are crazy times, but back in the 1970s they were even crazier. You can see from this graph of the General Building Cost Index that inflation was rampant towards the end of the 70s, and price adjustment formula were used on the majority of contracts. And you will see that their use has declined during periods of low inflation, and quite clearly is coming back into practice now when we need something in order to share the risk of inflation between the parties to the contract. As I've said, the current standard contracts, the JCT and the NEC, both allow for the use of index-linked inflation adjustment. The JCT offers two approaches. The one, and the traditional one, is to break down the initial tender into work categories, and then the value of each work category is index linked to the appropriate index in each valuation. So this matches the inflation in the things that are included in each valuation to a specific index. The other approach is to weight the work categories together as they are represented within the contract and apply a single index in the valuation. This does mean that you are applying an index that has a bit of painting to excavation and an index that has a bit of excavation to painting. But it was used quite widely, even when it was first introduced. The LCC, as it was then, applied it to housing, having a single model, because it made it very much easier to apply, and it was less precise, but it was much more easy to use. Today, when we can use computers to do these things, I'm not sure that there's much difference between the time taken to apply either approach. The NEC contract takes the second JCT approach. It sets out a standard weighting for the indices to be applied in each valuation. So the same mix of indices. We have a case study which is available on the BCIS website, which we did with Crossrail, which set out how they applied the NEC X1 clauses to that project. They agreed all the things that we talked about earlier about what the mix should be, what the base date should be, how they were going to apply with it, how they were going to deal with revisions. All those matters were agreed with the contractor before they started. They chose the contracts to which they would apply inflation, to those which were longer or larger, where they thought they would get the best price by sharing the risk of inflation with the contractor. They set out for each contract a different set of weightings which reflected the work on those particular projects. It was mainly the stations and some of the civil engineering contracts, but they had different weightings for each of those contracts. The indices can also be used in different ways and with different things. In this latest period, we have seen individual resources or work categories being index linked within a contract, particularly things like steel work when the price was very volatile and you couldn't get a firm price that would be held for more than a week. The indices are widely used on maintenance contracts. There is a series for highways maintenance, which is used very widely in that sector. And for building maintenance, the indices can be modelled so that you can update a schedule of rates, either as a single index or for individual trades. For the PSA schedule of rates, there are the measured contract updating percentage, which are designed specifically to be used with those schedules of rates. The indices are also used on long-term contracts for things we know about and probably for things we don't know about. So for the supply of individual resources, there are, again, coming back to steelwork, that I know there are contracts that have just the steelwork index applied over a very long period of time. Mineral rights contracts, I've seen contracts with these going for 50 years or more, where the index is used to apply to the extraction rights for aggregates. They're applied in development agreements between landowners and developers to index the cost of the building work, and they have also been used to adjust the community infrastructure levy contributions.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, really insightful look into the implementation of indices, and I think using the example of Crossrail was nice to see how it kind of works in real life practice. So before we move into the Q&A sort of segment, we thought we would summarise the key points which we hope you will take away from today's webinar. We've tried to categorise those into sort of two areas, I guess. So firstly, our 6 golden rules to follow when choosing an index or group of indices. So if I start with sort of rule number 1, just be clear about what you're trying to measure and how you want to imply the inflation clause. Choose an index that is measuring the costs that most closely match that. If you use an index to link the cost of something in a contract or agreement, be clear that it meets your needs, particularly in respect of frequency of the publication, updating and the revisions of that index. Understand the inputs to the index and the calculation methodology, and linked to that, it's read the notes and definitions. Make sure it covers what you're specifically trying to cover, and never choose an index because of its past performance, because in the future it may not perform in exactly the same way. And I guess linked very much to what Joe was talking about, the implementation of all those sort of principles. We've come up with 11 considerations, and appreciate it's quite a list, but you know, Joe covered it off, but I'll try to sort of summarize it. So you know, first of all, clearly define the work that is subject to be adjusted by the index. You need to ensure that the mix of indices represents the work being undertaken, as the indices selected will affect the price change recorded and should be chosen carefully to best represent the work subject to indexation and the intentions of both parties. Within the contract, ensure that the reference to the chosen indices is clear with the complete title, index number, and any identifying codes, not just stating something like the BCIS index. Alongside the index title, you should check the availability and frequency of the index to ensure that it aligns to the needs of your contract. There's no point picking an adjustment of an inflation for monthly if the index is only updated annually. Clearly state the base date for updating and the frequency of the price adjustment. The indexation clause should specify whether price adjustments are to be made at fixed intervals, for example, monthly, quarterly, or annually, or at stages of the contract. It is important to specify the date of the price adjustment calculations are to be made and what index is to be used. In normal practice, this is the latest version of the index available on the date specified. The contract needs to be clear on how to deal with the changing status of the indices, for example, from provisional through to firm. Some contracts allow for inflation to be recalculated in later periods when provisional indices become firm. In other examples, that is not the case. Aligned to that point, the contract should clearly articulate how to implement revisions to the index, changes to the index base date, and a discontinuation of the index. With PAFI indices, for example, revisions are rare, and the indices will continue to be calculated on superseded series. As Ian explained earlier, the process for calculating the inflation adjustment is straightforward. However, this needs to be clearly defined within the contract. And finally, state the number of decimal places that are to be used in the resulting calculation, as even the slightest rounding up or down can result in notable cost implications. We really hope you've enjoyed today's webinar. I would like to thank my colleagues Joe, David and Ian for their time and contribution to this session. We will now undertake a short Q&A, so stick around to hear more. And as I said at the beginning of this presentation, for any questions that aren't answered, we will also add those to our website. So I'll kick things off with the first question we have, and it's one which gets asked a lot, and it's in regard to the price adjustment formula indices, or PAFI as we kind of refer to them, where clearly there are a number of series available. Which ones should you select? So first of all, yes, there are a number of different options. We cover buildings, civil engineering, highways maintenance, and specialist engineering. And I guess combined with that, there are also different series within a series. So we have Series 2 and the 1990 series within civils, for example. So I guess the short answer is that we would always recommend that you use the latest series unless a specific series has been stipulated by a contract. I guess if you're preparing a contract for the first time, then we would recommend that you specify the latest series available appropriate to the works. And I guess link it back to rules 1 and 2 of our 6 golden rules to index selection, where be clear about what you're trying to measure and how you're trying to apply it, and then think about the index or group of indices that most closely match to that work.
So we've had a question come in about why not use the CPI as a measure of inflation on a construction project? And we actually get asked this question quite a lot. Broadly, it's to do with the basket of goods used for the whole economy measure, like the CPI, which really won't represent the inputs to a construction project. If you want to measure inflation on a construction project, it really makes no sense to index it to non-construction costs, such as food and clothes and electronic items. However, PAFI measures changes to specific construction resources or work categories, whereas CPI is a general inflation measure. I mean, the differences are quite dramatic and certainly have been over the recent past. The movement in construction costs and general inflation can vary quite dramatically. For example, on a 24-month contract let in February 2021, there were months over the 2-year period where civil engineering cost increases were over 11% higher than the CPI. And the difference between CPI and general building cost increases was over 7%. And that's sort of general cost movement. If you look at particularly volatile resources, the differences can be even greater. If we look at steel, for instance, over the same period, the 2 years from February 21, there were months when steelwork prices had increased 80% more than the CPI. Steel prices have fallen in recent months, but they're still 30% higher than inflation that's measured by the CPI. So, PAFI indices track inflation for more than 200 construction resources and work categories and are tailored to the specific needs of our industry. And this allows, or the use of PAFI allows, the resources to be modelled to a specific project design and therefore cover the actual inputs to the project. The monthly PAFI index also allows inflation to be applied in the month that the actual cost occurred, which is obviously a useful feature as it provides results that most closely match costs as they happen. So, going back to the original question, why not use the CPI as a measure of inflation on a construction contract? For the contractor, a contractor will give their best price if the risk of inflation in their costs is clearly identified. Using CPI or some other non-construction index requires the contractors to make an estimate, not just of their own cost increases, but also an estimate of the movement in the CPI. And this introduces an additional risk.
One question we have here is, where can I find all the background information for an index? Well, there are two places. The easiest way is probably to go into the index series section and select the index that you're interested in, go to either the results page or the view page, and if you look to the right of the index title, you'll see a little help icon, the question mark in a circle, and hover your mouse over that, and after a little bit of introductory text, it should give you one or more links to the pages that contain all the details and definitions for that index. So that's if you've actually found the index. Another way is from the overall page. If you go to the very top right hand corner of the service, you'll see a general help icon. Click on that and look in and select documentation. Within that section you can find all the different pages that contain definitions, notes and definitions for all the indices. So that's an alternative way without selecting the index first.
Great, thanks Ian, and of course to David as well for fielding those questions. Right, we're going to wrap things up here. A huge thank you to all of today's presenters and to all of you for attending. And just a bit of a plug, just a quick reminder to follow the BCIS on LinkedIn to keep up to date with all the latest news and insights, and of course to keep an eye out for future webinars that we're going to be hosting. Many thanks, have a great rest of your day and see you all soon.